Live stream audio test, 1, 2.
9:30, the inquiry is resumed. First things first, I've been advised that Mr. Wadsley has gone down with COVID, I'm afraid, so he's not able to be with us in person, but is able to be with us virtually. And there he is, as if by magic. Good morning, Mr. Wadsley.
Good morning, sir. I apologise for the problem that I'm undoubtedly causing. Would it help and perhaps reassure people if I just explain the circumstances very briefly, if that's agreeable to you, sir?
Well, please do.
Thank you. For various reasons, I was testing all last week, and up to and including Friday, I tested negative. Over the weekend, we saw my daughter and my small grandson. I tested it on, I think, either late Monday or early Tuesday, and was negative again. But on Tuesday afternoon, my daughter apparently tested positive for COVID. I didn't know this until after I left the inquiry. And so, out of abundance of caution, I tested this morning, and that's the result, I'm afraid. So that's the position, and I hope that people who were in contact with me yesterday will, to some degree anyway, have a little bit of reassurance from what I've said.
Well, thank you for explaining things, and I'm sure everybody wishes everybody concerned a swift recovery. Can I? You appear well, if you don't mind me saying so. What I'm going to is really trying to assess your wellness to participate today. It bodes well, but I'd rather ask if you don't mind.
Thank you, sir. Not at all. I have a slight sore throat and a slight cold at the moment. If it continues like this, I hope it does. there isn't any sort of major problem. But I'm quite content, sir, to continue for the rest of the session, however long that takes.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for letting us all know. I'm sure we'll go away and get tested if we've not already done so. I suppose the good news is you're on first this morning, so you'll sort of get your closing out of the way, which might help matters. Okay, we'll pause with that and the closings for a moment. There were a couple of housekeeping points from yesterday regarding the site visits. Have we got a sort of a final bundle for the visits to the four people, and also for my unaccompanied part of the site visit, please?
Yes, so we've agreed between the main parties and the Rule 6 party, as I mentioned yesterday, a list of the 4 addresses, and they're marked on a map for you. A walk around the site, as it were, again shown on a map. And then there's just a third piece of paper, and we're aware that you might have already done these wider viewpoints unaccompanied, but we'd ask that if you haven't, those can be undertaken by yourself. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I suspect I'll have done some of them, but not others. But rest assured, I will do them all. Thank you. That's appreciated. And have everybody seen these? I think you told me. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you for everybody's input to that. It's much appreciated. I'll look at that at one of the breaks this morning. I think probably the way it will pan out is I think we'll need a break at some point. But the way things stand, I think what we'll probably do is hear from Mr. Wadsley, then Mr. Storer, then perhaps take a break, and then before we hear from the appellants in closing. But we'll see how the time goes. Okay. Is there anything else before we hear the council's closing? Mr. Boyd.
So only on, I don't think it'll be a problem, but we've only just sent my closing to the council, so that'll need to be printed behind the scenes, but I think that'll catch up by the time we get to that point.
Yeah, there won't be a delay. We'll arrange for that to be done upstairs. No?
Okay. Well, depending on quite what the timings are, you'd hope there's enough leeway, but thank you. Okay.
Sorry, sir. We do have one more piece of paper, which again I've shared with both of the parties and are agreed for you to have a copy if you're happy to accept it. It's just a record of the live stream views, so the amount of people who've been following the inquiry online, for your note.
Okay, that's intriguing. I can't resist having a quick look. Okay, thank you. All right, I'll pop that away. I think that is it, unless somebody's going to tell me otherwise in terms of housekeeping. Okay. Good. Mr. Wadsley, are you ready?
Yes, thank you very much, sir. You've hopefully got a hard copy of
I
what I'm
haven't
going
yet.
to say.
That was going to be my next. Here it comes. Here it comes. At least I think here it comes. Thank you. That's appreciated. Thank you. It's just being distributed now, Mr. Wadsley.
Thank you.
Just if you just bear with me a moment, there's a long walk to Mr. Storer. We're nearly there. Okay. Well, whenever you're ready, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I start by saying that you're invited to read this closing statement in conjunction with the Council's opening statement. And could I just add that, of course, there are a number of footnotes, and I also, of course, invite you in due course to read the footnotes, so I don't propose myself to read them out and prolong this unnecessarily. The appeal proposal, as amended, seeks the grant of permission for up to 61 dwellings on an area of agricultural land outside the settlement boundary of Wrington to the southwest of the village. As well as being in the open countryside, the land is part of the setting of the prominent Grade 1 listed All Saints Church to the north of the site. As I indicated in opening, this submission is aimed at what has been called Appeal A during the inquiry. Appeal B, which relates to the northern access to the site, that's Westwood Close, is not contested, subject to the application of a granting condition for its implementation and any other necessary conditions, which of course were discussed yesterday. The you indicated in opening that in opening the inquiry that there were three main issues: the effect of the development on the setting and significance of the Grade 1 listed All Saints Church, the effect of the development on the character and appearance of the area, whether any harm from the development was outweighed by other considerations, particularly the issue of housing land supply. So the Grade 1 listed church. The proper approach in law and policy is that great weight should be given to the asset's conservation, and the more important the asset, the greater the weight should be, and that's paragraph 199 of the framework. Furthermore, the finding of harm to a designated heritage asset gives rise to a strong presumption against the grant of permission. That is because the harm must be given, and I quote, considerable importance and weight, and you have the references to those matters. Policy prescribes a balance to be struck, the harm being weighed against any public benefits of the scheme, that's paragraph 202 of the framework, as in this case it is common ground that the harm is less than substantial. This will be dealt with below. The Grade 1 listed church, with its magnificent prominent tower in the centre of the oldest part of the village, dominates it and stands out in the countryside. It is a key landmark. Its significance is added to by its setting, of which the appeal site is part, where its architectural significance and its place in the landscape in the village can be appreciated. The church in its present form probably dates from the 15th century. And again, I give you footnote references to that. The tower, which can be clearly seen in the surrounding countryside, has 4 stages, was built to be seen, and emphasises the importance of the church and probably its benefactors who paid for its building. Whether or not it is design views, it's agreed it did not, is irrelevant in this context. It's accepted that a church with a tower of this size is indeed built to be seen. Consequently, its setting and the significance of that setting will be seen in the immediate countryside and not merely in its immediate surroundings in the village. And the footnote reference there, I point out that if the tower had been built very much smaller, very much shorter, as with some parish churches, then you might think it had only been built to be seen within the confines of the village. The position of both heritage experts is set out in the Statement of Common Ground. They record that the setting includes the appeal site, which contributes to its significance, and that there is a less than substantial harm to the church, which is at the lowermost end. It's clear from the evidence of both experts that the principal impact upon the setting and significance of the church is from views over the appeal site from the south and southwest. At the moment, these views are over unspoiled agricultural fields across the existing development on the south side of the village to the church tower. It does not appear to be suggested that the existing development materially affects adversely the church's significance, but is simply the baseline for the present assessment. And I give you a footnote to what might be the position if that were otherwise, but I don't propose to read that. The architectural feature of the church can at present be appreciated in views from the south and southwest, which are over the appeal site from the permissive footpath and from the road immediately to its east. It's important to note that the evidence from third parties was that these routes and the linked public rights of way are popular walking routes in the village and much used. And again, I give you the footnote to the witnesses who dealt with that. It is correct that views from the permissive footpath are, depending on the time of year, views that may be glimpsed through gaps in the trees and vegetation. However, Mr. Etchell's evidence, and again you've got a footnote to that and some of the other evidence which, as I said, I'm not going to read out, was that such gaps tended to be important for walkers where they could pause and view the countryside and village edge over what was otherwise a semi-enclosed route. The effect of the development is illustrated by the wireframes, viewpoints 2 and 4 principally, which show that the development will result in the severance of sightlines for the church tower and a reduction in the area where the architectural significance of the church and its position in the landscape and the wider rural area can be appreciated. What could be seen across agricultural fields, which so far as can be judged were probably part of the setting when the tower was raised, will now be seen across the intervention of modern development with, for the fortunate, glimpsed views through a viewing corridor set out between the houses. This is unquestionably harmful in a way agreed by the experts. It's suggested that there's a benefit from the setting out of some public open space in the northeast part of the proposed development and from where the church tower can be seen. There is no evidence of the likely user of this public open space. There are no viewpoints to assess its benefit, if any, and Miss Armstrong did not suggest that her assessment of the harm and its level was affected by this benefit. The harm is principally calibrated by the test in framework paragraph 202, but it is also covered by policies CS5 and DM4 and is contrary to them. It is of course accepted that they do not have the balance to be struck which is contained in paragraph 202 of the framework. 3 points can be made. The first is that the balance was actually struck in the officer report. There's no question of any prejudice from misapplication of policy. The second is that policy is contained in a local plan which survived unamended and sound the local plan inquiry at a time when the version of the framework was materially the same as paragraph 202 now is. The third is that guidance shows that it is not necessary to follow slavishly and repeat the words of national policies, and I give you references to that. In conclusion, this is one of our most important heritage assets, a Grade 1 listed building which is admittedly being caused harm, albeit less than substantial. It is correct, for the reasons given by Mr. Reynolds, to give substantial weight to such harm to such an important building. That is not least because of the strong presumption against the grant of permission where such harm is established. So I turn next, sir, to the character and appearance of the area, which of course is are the landscape issues. The proposed development of 61 dwellings up to 2 stories in height will be highly visible and indeed prominent because it will run across a locally prominent ridgeline. A large part of it is on a south-facing slope, which is itself prominent in views towards the Grade 1 listed church from various approaches to the south. It is not a site which is generally well contained and is open to views from the west and south. The result is that the development will be visible and obtrusive from areas around the site. Mr. Etchell's careful assessment shows that there is, unsurprisingly, an overlap between landscape and heritage harm. Views of the church over the appeal site are part of landscape impact. Of course, there's a foot. He has assessed the landscape and visual impact of the development and the corresponding harms. His methodology is set out in his proof and has not been seriously criticised. Mr. Lea, by contrast, for the appellants, has not done the same exercise but has relied on the LPIA and its assessment. The effect of this will be considered below. Traditionally, a landscape assessment is dealt with by considering the character of the landscape and the impact on that and the visual and in addition, of course, the visual impacts of the development. There is an overlap between the two, but that is a convenient and appropriate analysis. As a preliminary to the detail of the assessment, there is a North Somerset landscape sensitivity assessment carried out by Wardell Armstrong in 2018. This shows the sensitivity of the site and the land close by to the west south and north is high. Furthermore, the separate landscape guidelines for the area, the landscape character assessment, indicate that one should, and I quote, conserve the rural pastoral character of the area. And of course, the area of the site and around it is largely of a rural and pastoral character, albeit the village is present to the northeast. This is important because, first, Policy CS5 supports the landscape character assessment, saying that the character, distinctiveness, diversity and quality of North Somerset's landscape and townscape will be protected and enhanced by the careful, sensitive management and design of development. Close regard will be paid to the character of, and particularly that of the 11 landscape types and 31 landscape character areas identified in the North Somerset Landscape Character Assessment. Second, M10 similarly supports the landscape character assessment by saying all development proposals should not have an unacceptable adverse impact on the designated landscape character of the district, as defined in the Landscape Character Assessment, Supplementary Planning Document 2005, and respond to the distinctive qualities of the landscape. And I point out that that, of course, is now superseded by the 2018 Character Assessment. While Policy CS5 is arguably in more general terms, in the sense that while it requires the protection and enhancement of the character, distinctiveness and quality of the landscape, it does so by the careful design, etc., of development. This might imply that the policy assumes development will take place unless it is wholly incompatible with the protection, etc., of the landscape. Even if that interpretation is correct, and I point out that that is not the Council's view, but I'm dealing with it in case something is said otherwise, Policy DM10 requires there to be no unacceptable adverse impact on the designated landscape character of the district. It should be given full weight because it is a recently adopted local plan policy which has survived the local plan process and has not been found to be incompatible with the framework. There is an unacceptable impact on the designated landscape character of this landscape character area. In particular, the development does not conserve the rural pastoral character of the area. The recent Farley Fields appeal decision, paragraph 98, indicated, correctly it's submitted, that the local plan landscape policies, including CS5 and DM10, should receive no reduction in weight when applied to any conflict with their provisions, as they were fully consistent with the framework. Hence, there is no conflict with, but rather a supplement to, the provisions of paragraph 174B of the framework. Dealing first with the sensitivity assessment, while it was carried out as a strategic assessment in the sense that it was intended to cover the landscape character areas in the district, it is also the case that looking at Wrington and the area around it, it goes into detail in a number of the separate sub-areas around the village. There are a number of points to be made. First, it's clear that while the map shows the area of the site as highly sensitive, it also shows other areas around Wrington as less so. It is not painted with a broad brush over swathes of the countryside, but has been careful to assess each area individually. Some are classified of medium and some of low sensitivity. Second, whilst the relevant character area is an area predominantly of countryside, it is the case that the assessment takes into account, where relevant, the fact that the countryside is affected, as here, by the edge of settlements. The methodology used by Wardell Armstrong and their assessment in the field shows that in assessing sensitivity of the landscape surrounding settlements, they had in mind, and I'm quoting, the settlement pattern, and again, I'm quoting, the nature of adjacent settlement edges. Put another way, there is no evidence that the assessment has been skewed because the authors were dealing with a predominantly countryside character area. Full weight should be given to this assessment in any consideration of the quality of the landscape and the effects of the development. In dealing with the development and its effects, there can be no doubt that it will be significant development of up to 61 new houses, of up to 2 stories in height, extending out to the west and south of the existing edge of the settlement. It will be seen across a locally prominent ridgeline and will be highly visible, and often prominent and visible from an area around the site, limited by the high ground of the Cleve Ridge to the north, the edge of the village to the east, and vegetation within the gently undulating landscape to the south and west. It should be noted that the LVIA at 6.4 indicates that the views across the site from viewpoint B, and you'll find that in Mr. Lie's appendices and also in the LVIA, sir, are attractive and wide-ranging. These will be lost as a result of the development. The development would introduce new built development onto a south-facing slope, which is prominent in the foreground and middle ground. The importance of this is because there are views towards the Grade 1 church from the southern approach to the village. The site is contained to the north and east by the edge of the settlement, and also to some extent by the hedge alongside Half Yard, further to the south. There's a trimmed hedgerow along the southern side of the area proposed for built development. These apart, the site is poorly contained and open to view from the west and south, with the western site boundary unmarked on the ground and running across an open field. In short, there will be a locally prominent incursion of built development into what is at present a largely rural and attractive area of countryside. That forms a setting to the village and gives attractive and distinctive views to the church from the south. The visual impact assessment suggests that the effects will be minor adverse only because, it says, the character of the site is already influenced by the adjacent residential areas. The implication of that might be that edge of settlement development almost automatically becomes acceptable following such an assessment. That will be wrong, because what the assessment, in making its finding of minor adverse, obviously, ignores, is the contribution the fields make to existing landscape character. For example, views across them to the Grade 1 church and views to the surrounding hills. The LVIA asserts, paragraph 1318, that the development enhances the edge of the village. This seems to be contrary to the assessment in 1313 of minor adverse effects, itself an assessment too low for the reasons I've just given. Finally, there is an intervening paddock to the east of the site, which is shown on the master plan as having access from the appeal site to an area plainly intended for development. That is a factor to be noted when considering the effect of the proposed development. When considering the harm to the landscape, that's to say impact on landscape character, Mr. Etchells has correctly, it's submitted, assessed the site and immediately surrounding area as a medium to high landscape quality and value, and high sensitivity to development of the type proposed. This is because the landscape has a limited ability to accommodate change, and that change will take place in a presently open area, which is important to the character and setting of the village. As to change, there will be a medium to high degree of change to the local landscape as a result of the proposed development. It would occupy a significant proportion of the presently open land at this point, and there will be a significant loss of that key characteristic. There would also be a loss of the presently open and attractive views across the site, including views of the church and to the wooded hills to the north. There would be, as Mr. Etchells indicated There would be, as Mr. Etchells indicated in evidence, moderate to high adverse effects on the character of the landscape of and around the site, reducing to moderate adverse by year 15 in summer following landscaping. That is because the development would be at variance with the pattern of the local landscape, would be locally visually intrusive, and would disrupt some important local views, would remove the attractive landscape features of the open fields which make up the site, and would introduce a significant scale of development to what is at the moment a largely peaceful pastoral landscape. This could not be adequately mitigated, as the wireframe views and photomontages demonstrate, and I give you a reference to those. This is an important adverse effect, given the terms of policies CS5 and DM10, and the LCA guidance which seeks to conserve the rural pastoral character of the area. So far as the framework is concerned, it is not suggested that this is a valued landscape within the meaning of paragraph 174A. but where there is a carefully assessed landscape character area and an equally careful sensitivity assessment, both speaking to the landscape quality of the area, and these should be given full weight, so that in terms of paragraph 174B of the framework, any decision can recognise, I quote, the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside, bearing in mind that paragraph 174 starts by saying that both policies and decisions should contribute, I'm quoting, should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment. It is difficult to see how the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside is recognised, still less how the natural and local environment is enhanced, if the rural and pastoral character of the area is not conserved. However, Mr. Lier thought that the part of the appeal site to the south gave an enhanced pastoral character, that's in cross-examination, as did the reinstatement of lost hedgerows, those would be to the west. The latter is a very small part of the landscape character area, and the former exists as open land already and will be compromised by the development. None of this, of course, is to stop necessary development. In a particular case, other policies may speak in its favour and may result in permission being granted, although the Council submits they do not do so here. Visual impact, in Mr. Etchell's opinion, also counts against the development. There will be significant adverse visual effects, mainly for residential properties adjoining the site, and for users of the public rights of way in the area around the site, and for people passing along Half Yard and Butts Batch. These adverse visual effects, first, can be seen in more detail in the wireframes or photo montages, and I give you the references, which I don't read out. Mr. Etchells, in his paragraph 5.1.11, has commented in detail on the wireframes, what they show, and in particular on the effect of the development on the landscape. I do not set out the detail here, but it is more evidence of the adverse effect of the development on the landscape and views. And these are either moderate or high adverse from 5 or 6 of the properties to the north of the site, from a number of properties to the east of the site, from 3 or 4 properties to the south of the site, and from the users of various public rights of way or permissive paths from various directions around the site. The analysis and detail is in Mr. Etchell's proof of evidence. And it's worth stressing that from the evidence of the Rule 6 and third parties, these paths are valued walking routes, mainly for recreation and much used, often as circular routes. It is on recreational routes that, as is well known, particular attention may be paid to the surrounding landscape, and I've given you a reference to the evidence about that when dealing with heritage, sir. In section 7 of his proof of evidence, Mr. Etchells carefully analyses the terms of the landscape reasons refusal and correctly comes to the conclusion that it is justified and that there will be conflict with the policies cited. Overall, he concludes that the effect on the character and appearance of the area is that there will be a significant and long-term harm in all of these respects. Much of the rural character and landscape setting at this point would be significantly diminished and replaced by built development, and the development would obstruct many of the views of the church from the area around the site and significantly change the context of any which remain. Come to the third issue, sir, whether any harm from the development is outweighed by other considerations, particularly the issue of housing land supply. Wrington is classified as a service village and is dealt with under policies CS14 and CS32, as we discussed last week and yesterday. Policy CS14 states that there will be opportunities for small-scale development at service villages, either within or abutting settlement boundaries, or, importantly, through site allocations. Policy CS32 builds on this by stating that sites outside the settlement boundaries, in excess of about 25 dwellings, must be brought forward as allocations through local plans or neighbourhood plans. The proposed development is considerably in excess of this figure. It is intended to deal with a situation where service villages are at the lower end of the settlement hierarchy. They do not have a major capacity for growth, generally have limited services and facilities and supporting infrastructure, for example, public transport. They lack self-containment and would not generally be regarded as sustainable at the level of development proposed. The local plan inspector, when considering and approving this policy, was firmly of the view that it allowed necessary flexibility while preserving the character of a service village like Wrington. He observed that, and I quote, larger unallocated development will present a significant risk to the spatial strategy. It is entirely appropriate, in accordance with the plan-led system, that larger sites should be brought forward in local plan or neighbourhood plan allocations. The inspector considered the interaction of the policies relating to the spatial strategy, particularly CS14 and CS32. CS14 tells us that there will be opportunities for small-scale development either within or abutting settlement boundaries. CS32 builds on that by setting out criteria for development and adding sites outside the settlement boundaries in excess of about 25 dwellings must be brought forward as allocations through local plans or neighbourhood plans. The justificatory text refers to the need for appropriate consultation and infrastructure planning for larger developments through the plan-led system. And I give you the paragraph reference. The local plan inspector supported development outside settlement boundaries of an appropriate scale to achieve flexibility in the delivery of housing, and supported the allocation of, and I quote, a considerably smaller proportion of the overall total of increases in dwellings for the service villages. Supported putting a maximum size for development on unallocated sites, and considered that the policy, as it is now, would improve the flexibility of the plan. Specifically, in relation to CS32, he said, neither significant restrictions on housing development nor substantial amounts of additional housing represent a sound or balanced approach towards settlements which contain a range of services and facilities, but which are in essence still villages. Having referred to the ability of service villages to handle a range of smaller schemes, he added, however, larger scale schemes or substantial cumulative growth will be more likely to alter the character of the villages, place undue burdens on infrastructure and the road network, and threaten the spatial strategy. It's not without reason that these concerns have been raised by a number of communities. He then supported the present version of CS32 as a sound modification, which is, I'm quoting, neither too restrictive nor too liberal. It is a sound modification that allows the service villages to contribute more to the overall requirement, whilst avoiding development of an excessive scale with the negative impacts described above. While other inspectors have given reduced weight to this part of CS32 because of the application of framework paragraph 11D and footnote 8, and I say that the Council does not dispute such an approach in principle, it is to be noted that the landscape policies of the plan have not received reduced weight in one of the most recent appeals, which is the Fairley Fields one I've referred to already, and there is no reason why the other criteria in CS32, some of which also relate to landscape issues, should not be treated in the same way. This is indeed the position in the Statement of Common Ground, Appendix 3, where substantial weight is agreed to be attributed, my interpolation there, for the bulleted points sub-paragraphs. Whilst the housing land supply shortfall is obviously highly material, there is no reason why it should override other up-to-date landscape policies, nor in effect why a perfectly sensible restriction on development close to service villages should be permitted, contrary to the terms of policy CS32. There are two reasons for this. The first is that there are criteria in CS32 which show that the development should not be permitted. These are that development should, I quote, respect and enhance the local character, and should have high quality schemes which are, and I quote again, appropriate to its context and make a positive contribution to the local environment and landscape setting. On the evidence of Mr. Etzels and Dr. Hudson Macaulay, the development does neither of these things. The second is that the restriction is not an arbitrary one or merely procedural, but was carefully considered. A number of points are important. First, Mr. Marsh, the appellant, accepted in cross-examination that the local plan inspector's analysis was a sensible one, and that in allocating weight to CS32 outside the bulleted points, account should be taken of this analysis and why the policy was amended. Second, that the Council has demonstrated flexibility in line with the intent of the policy is demonstrated by the development of 59 dwellings at Cox's Green and the grant of permission for up to 38 dwellings at Gackham Farm close to the village, and I footnote a reference to the policy. which wasn't CS32. The policy has not been treated as a means of frustrating development. Indeed, the council has followed the inspector's injunction not to place, I quote, significant restrictions on housing development. The corollary is that substantial amounts of additional housing do not represent a sound or balanced approach to settlements which are still villages. This scheme for 61 dwellings is one of the larger scale schemes which should not be encouraged unless it comes forward as a local plan allocation, when it can be considered appropriately whether it should continue as a development as a service village, whether indeed it is more appropriate to take place at a higher order settlement. This is to follow the sound and balanced approach of the local plan inspector. Fourth, it would not be the case that any number of developments could come forward if they were restricted to 25 dwellings each. I mention that because it's a possibility that has been canvassed. But that is because bullet point 5 of CS32 says that development, quote, does not result in significant adverse cumulative impacts within the wider area. The clear intent of policy CS32 is that developments of any size greater than the policy parameters, such as the present appeal, should be dealt with through the local plan process. This cannot be dismissed simply as a procedural approach. It is obviously sensible because it allows for sites to be considered with other sites or at other locations which may be more suited to development of the relevant size. And I footnote a reference there to a discussion I had with Mr. Marsh about the ward of Wrington and Bristol Airport in that context, and I set it out in the footnote for, I suppose, interest. This shows the planning process operating appropriately, allowing local input and not undermining the local plan process. The council contends that for all these reasons, substantial weight should be given to the whole of the policy. Even if that reference to substantial weight is wrong, the weight that should be given is more than limited. Limited was the weight given by other inspectors, so as you know, weight should be given is more than limited in relation to the settlement boundary issue. More broadly, the harm to the Grade 1 listed church and to the landscape, combined with the conflict with policy CS32, in at least those respects where it deals with landscape effects, provide proper reasons for dismissing this appeal. Plainly, as against that, the advantages of the residential development, particularly where there isn't a 5-year housing land supply, must be considered. The council has between a 3.2 and 3.5 year housing land supply, depending on whether the conclusions of the Rectory Farm or Backwell appeal decisions are accepted. In either event, the shortfall is highly material. Footnote 8 of the framework is engaged, which affects the weight to be given to that part of policy CS32 and has been dealt with above. Mr. Reynolds correctly observes that significant weight should be given to the benefits of providing both market and affordable housing. He has dealt with other benefits of the development, which in his view attract either moderate or limited weight, some because they are either in reality means of mitigating the effects of the development, for example, provision of open space, or because they are temporary or transient, for example, construction jobs. The harms have been referred to above. The development is clearly contrary to the adopted settlement hierarchy in a local plan which is arrived at for carefully considered reasons. It would cause less than substantial harm to the setting and significance of the Grade 1 listed church, and it will also have a significant adverse impact on the landscape character of the area and also on views over that landscape. Mr. Reynolds is right to attribute substantial weight to both those harms. These are harms which are to all intents and purposes permanent. Footnote 8 being engaged means that normally the tilted balance would apply, and the issue would be whether the harm significantly and demonstrably outweighed the benefits of the development. However, it is accepted that there is less than substantial harm to the setting and significance of the Grade 1 church, a designated heritage asset. Accordingly, where the application of policies in this framework that protect areas or assets of particular importance provides a clear reason for refusing the development proposed, the tilted balance is not applied. In this case, under footnote 7, there's a designated heritage asset which suffers less than substantial harm from the development. The decided cases and framework policies relating to heritage assets, namely paragraphs 199 and 202, provide such a reason. The position is therefore that the tilted balance is not applied, and it must be decided whether the harm to the heritage asset outweighs the benefits of the scheme. If it does, the appeal fails. If it does not, it is then necessary to consider whether all the harms from the development outweigh the benefits of the scheme. This exercise will include any heritage harm. In carrying out this exercise, a tilted balance will be applied. As I said in opening, and I repeat, it is the submission of the Council that whichever test is applied, the appeal fails. Concentrating on the tilted balance, the harm to the setting and significance of the Grade 1 church carries substantial weight, as does the harm to the landscape as assessed by Mr. Etchells. Combined with a non-compliance with policy CS 32, they are sufficient to significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits, and for these reasons, the appeal should be dismissed. As I said above at paragraph 3, the Council does not contest the appeal B, in relation to the northern access to the site at Westwood Close, subject to the points made there. This additional link is important given the criticism of third parties about the difficulties and lack of safety for walking routes on and off pavement around the village. As I also explained in opening, and as was canvassed during the heritage evidence, the Council has also altered its position on the issue of harm to the conservation area. The reason for refusal referred to such harm. However, in the course of the appeal, the appellant has provided a revised layout parameter plan with smaller dwellings for the lower ridge heights and has limited the amount of development in the southern part of the site. Subject to appropriate conditions, the Council considers that the harm to the wider setting of the conservation area is sufficiently mitigated. And so those are my closing submissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wadsley.
Thank you, Mr. Wadsley.
Getting a bit of feedback. Okay. Could you mute, please, Mr. Wadsley? Otherwise, I think this might be a recurring theme. Thank you. Mr. Storr, are you ready to give your closing submissions?
Yes, sir. If I can just hand these up to...
Please do. Thank you. Thank you. Whenever you're ready, please.
Thank you, sir. So this is our closing speech on behalf of Keith Wrington as Wrington and the villagers of Wrington Village. I've set out on the opening page, it's by way of introduction, and then it will be split into Appeal A under various headings, Appeal B, and then ending with the conclusion. By way of introduction, the proposed site, which forms part of the rolling pastoral landscape of Wrington Vale, is extremely important to the setting of the village and shapes one's initial impression of Wrington as a quintessentially English village. This view is appreciated by villagers and visitors alike, as can be seen by the very clear opposition to this appeal, not only by the residents of Wrington but also neighbouring villages. The opposition was clear when the inquiry relocated to Wrington for the day. The memorial hall was packed. The official register shows 120 recorded attendees, and with 18, and I've had to amend that figure, sir, I've miscounted, 18 choosing to speak on a variety of concerns. These included Wrington's district councillor and parish councillors representing residents of the neighbouring village of Lower Langford. I would also like to take this opportunity to publicly acknowledge all this support and thank the 5 Wrington villagers who agreed to appear here as witnesses for Keep Wrington as Wrington. They very clearly showed why this proposal have an adverse impact on the village, and these are not outweighed by any benefits put forward for this development. I will repeat here that Keep Wrington as Wrington are in full agreement with the Council's reasons for refusal, and the following submission should be seen in the context of supporting their position. Under the heading of destruction of landscape setting, Mr. Etchells' evidence clearly showed how the proposed site was in the area marked as J2 on the Wardle and Armstrong landscape assessment, was of high sensitivity and must be protected. His photographs of the landscape clearly enabled the Grade 1 listed church to be viewed in a pastoral setting, a rolling pastoral countryside from many different viewpoints. Mr. Dorr passionately described the importance of this site, not only for villagers using the much frequented surrounding public rights of way and permissive footpaths, but also visitors who either walk or drive into the village via this southern gateway. He described how the village nestled against the backdrop of Wrington Hill, with the architecturally renowned four-stage Tower of All Saints clearly visible, much as it would have been since it was built in the Middle Ages. He referenced the Bronze Age and the Roman heritage. He set out how the landscape gives the village a sense of place and scale, and how this gives Wrington the feel of the old English village. He pointed out that to restrict or hinder these views by building on the field known as Butts Batch would be destroyed. Mr. Dorr also asserted that the proposed development site would be highly visible from both the south and west access roads, as it is located on top of the highest point in Wrington Vale. He described how this would replace the perception of the quaint old English village with one of a modern urban sprawl, thereby destroying the charm and beauty the open pasture land currently brings. He highlighted how the fields change with the seasons, and this perception was later added to by Miss Wahab, who referenced the wildlife that lives in the field, in particular the family of deer. As was shown during Ms. Armstrong's evidence, the proposed site itself has been clearly marked as Butts Batch in the Ordnance Survey maps since 1981, giving the proposed site an historical significance in its own right. Miss Bigg for the CPRE referenced North Somerset Council's policy CS5 as recognising the importance of the local landscape and the need to protect it. She also referenced National Policy Framework of 2021 Section 3 Plan Making Bullet 15, which says local people should shape their surroundings. Many of the speakers in the Memorial Hall, some of them from the neighbouring parish of Churchill, highlighted the negative impact that the development would have on the landscape and the setting of the church and village. District Councillor Hogg perfectly described it as an urbanised appendage. He went on to add that this would in turn vastly diminish its sense of history, destroying the perception of a countryside setting and that of a small village. Other speakers also gave evidence about the beauty of the pastoral landscape, including Mr. Matthews and Mr. Harden, who has written books on local public rights of way and footpaths. He described how the permissive footpath to the south of Butts Batch is used daily by dog walkers and others, and also the high frequency of use of these routes makes them critical viewpoints. And he concluded by saying the scheme would degrade the setting of the village, and it would not retain the views of the church or Wrington Hill behind. Miss Grieveson stated that the proposed development was outside the village boundary and would destroy the landscape and countryside more generally, at a time when we should be securing our food supply. She also pointed out her house in Kings Road was built in the 1930s and not post-war, and this was correcting an earlier misrepresentation of the neighbouring houses. The issue regarding the incorrect dating of the houses to the east of the site as post-World War II was acknowledged by the Appellant's Council after these residents dated their houses from 1926 and 1930. Mr. Jacob from the neighbouring Churchill Parish Council describes the local lanes and footpaths being of medieval origin, and also how this development would overpower the landscape. The theme of the high ground was continued by Miss McGee and Miss Brown. Both drew attention to the height of the hill and how adding two-storey houses to this high ground would overshadow their houses and gardens in Wiltons, thereby removing all privacy from their bedrooms. And meanwhile, Mr. Lier for the appellant did agree and rather like the description of Wrington nestling in the landscape. He did not consider that the height of development on this high ground would destroy this premise. This, in spite of the height of the two-storey houses on the high ground obscuring so much of Wrington Hill and the landscape behind. His view differed from all the witnesses, who described the proposed site as overpowering or towering above the surrounding landscape. In contrast to these opinions, Mr. Lier contended that the proposed site was adjacent to the village boundary, and as a historic hedge line was due to be reinstated on the western boundary, it would be better than the currently stark edge of the existing houses. He did not consider that the proposed landscaping of hedges and many clumps of trees would also modify the existing rolling pasture land and therefore alter the very fabric of the landscape. Mr. Liais had assessed the impact on the landscape to be only moderate, despite having belatedly acknowledged the site forms part of the area marked as J2 on the Wardle-Armstrong mapping, and this argument relied upon this proposed site being adjacent to the built form of the village, and it would somehow improve the landscape. When questioned, he stated the Wardle-Armstrong assessment was more relevant to a field 500 metres to the west, and therefore it was that field which would have high sensitivity. Tellingly, Wardle-Armstrong assessment states, to the west of the village, the land is open, visually prominent, and located outside of the development form, and there are no landscape features that could potentially limit development sprawl. Owing to this, this land is of high sensitivity. Page 52 with the reference there, sir. Miss McGee also expressed the concern that once this development was granted, it would set a precedent to continue building further west. She was aware that it was outside the appeal site, but thought it ought to be an ethical consideration. Miss Wrington also foresaw how the spread westwards would eventually lead to the urbanisation of the landscape as the villages of Wrington, Congsbury and Churchill morphed into one massive urban area. Under harm to Grade 1 listed church and village conservation area, Keep Wrington as Wrington maintained that this proposed development causes substantial harm to the Grade 1 listed church and conservation area within the village. This is due to the position of the site on high ground, currently obscuring all but one or two views of the church. The fear of the villagers is that even these will be lost if the houses were to be built, and Mr. Marsh did concede that the proposed outline plans are only illustrative and likely to evolve in the reserve matters process. The value of the setting in relation to the village in the history of the village was made clear by Mr. Dorr when he gave evidence of the site in relation to the church, and he, with others, set out how it would affect the appearance of the village when approached from the south. Miss Armstrong, for the appellant, acknowledged that the approach along Half Yard into the village was transitional from a rural to built form of settlement, but would not concede that the development would affect the conservation area, as there were later houses in between the two. Mr. Dorr maintained otherwise, saying that by removing the view of rolling pastoral landscape affected how the village, and therefore the history of the village, was viewed on entering the village. This would therefore reduce the significance of this conservation area. Mr. Seeger was another of the villagers who regularly walked the public rights of way and added to those who appreciated the landscape and setting the church whilst out exercising. He produced photographs to illustrate how high the two-storey roof line would be and that they would tower over the landscape, thereby obscuring the church and conservation area. Under the heading of proposed development is unsustainable, Mr. Reynolds clearly set out why the original application had been refused, and this included North Somerset Council's core strategy, CS32, amongst other reasons. Miss Bigg, speaking for the local chair of CPRE, also referenced CS32, CS5 and the local plan. She drew attention to the excessive number of proposed dwellings and how this development would be too large and could not be assimilated into the village due to the many changes and reduction in services since Wrington had been designated a service village. The issue of too many houses was covered by both Miss McGee and Miss Wrington. They expressed concern that if this appeal were allowed, then where would it stop, and the forecast that it would, in the not too distant future, they would morph, as mentioned earlier. Miss Bigg also spoke as someone who had been closely involved in the existing local plan consultations, giving evidence that 3/4 of the villagers who responded, and approximately 75 of those presented, had listed building, conservation area, local landscape and design, scale and fit of new developments as important or very important. She also gave evidence that night blight was a real concern in the local area, and that by building on this site would lead to the further light pollution into the recorded dark corridor to the west. She also highlighted how this application has not followed the plan-led process, and how the site has been refused in the council's land supply assessment 3 times, and that developments were not building out the permissions that had already been granted. Miss McGee had also made this point, and it mirrors the concerns of Dr. Fox MP. In an email to Keep Wrington as Wrington, dated the 22nd of March 2022, he quoted the following figures. Across the district as a whole, there are already permissions granted to build 11,608 homes. Only around 1,500 have been started. Historically, the actual build per year in North Somerset is 808 homes, so the current number of permissions granted should last for over 14 years. Even at a higher target of 1339, now being revised down, the current supplies would last almost 9 years. Linked to the development and urbanisation of this rolling pasture land site and the question of sustainability by removing a productive field from the food chain, Ms Murray, as the local parish council, highlighted how the impact of this proposed development will extend far beyond the confines of Wrington. This is due to the inappropriateness of the site sitting as it does to the west of Wrington, and therefore not having any direct access to the major trunk road to the A38 and A370, without first having to negotiate a very narrow section of road at the crossroads with Blackmore and Langford Road, thus highlighting the danger this would cause. Mr Jones, giving evidence for the appellant on traffic matters, stated this impact had not been assessed, as North Somerset Council Highways had not asked for it. Ms Murray also pointed out that unplanned development was bad development, as it was not in the right place, and how unplanned development had led to such a large cumulative increase in Churchill's population and was overwhelming schools, meaning children were now bused into Weston for their education. On the subject of sustainability, Ms Wahab, as a neighbouring resident to the proposed site and with a knowledge of farming, was able to give evidence of how the field was never idle, and she witnessed that the farmer was able to get 3 equal cuts of haylage from the field each season and then put cattle out to graze on it without having to supplement them with additional feed. She then went on to set out how the grazing cattle and the resultant dung beetles are a prime food source for the greater and lesser horseshoe bats that she sees foraging across the fields. Bearing in mind this site is within the North Somerset and Mendip Hills Zone B of the Bat Special Area Conservation. Also there are 10 other species of bats recorded in the Shadow HRA. She points out that the removal of the grazing cattle will remove this food source along with its unique biome. All of her evidence contrasts with the appellant's agricultural assessment that this land is Grade 4. She stated that this was at odds with what had been witnessed, but conceded that Keep Wrington as Wrington did not have the funds to carry out their own survey. However, the Natural England Agricultural Land Survey did show that this area was classed as Grade 3, although it is not specific to this field. Ms Wahab said this was not a sustainable development under paragraph 7 National Planning Policy Framework, footnote 4. Sustainability was also a concern of Ms Greaves, both stated there are many brownfield sites that could be built on to provide the proposed number of dwellings. Mr Thornywork introduced himself as a keen environmentalist and naturalist, asserted how the proposed site would have a negative impact on the wildlife and environment, referencing that 1 in 7 native species are endangered and that we should be protecting the natural world. This included not developing land that only added to global warming and climate change. He concluded by saying there were figures showing that there are 100,000 houses were empty and we need to repurpose existing housing stock. On the subject of pedestrian safety, Miss Marwood gave her evidence and graphically described the perils of walking to school with young children. She described how the footways were not wide enough and obstructed by parked cars and or bins, and how the bottleneck at Railway Wharf was very dangerous. Her evidence concluded with why she thought building the development would only increase the danger of pedestrians due to the lack of suitable footways and access to the village. So, with so many poor access routes, many new many new residents would drive to the school instead. This would then lead to more traffic and therefore increase the danger to those who did walk, either for reasons of disability, financial constraints, or ethical reasons. She then went on to explain why the 5 alternative routes proposed by Mr Jones in his evidence were not at all suitable for use as alternatives. Ms Marwood produced a number of photographs of the traffic, pavements and footpaths. All these graphically illustrated the problems of pedestrian access to the centre of the village and the primary school. Miss Denny set out the footpath link from Batch and the centre of the village and school were not suitable for a double buggy, and she had been forced to drive her children to school until recently. This was a necessity and not a lifestyle choice. She highlighted bin day in the village was always a problem, and more traffic would only increase the existing danger. Mr Jones, when shown photographs 9 and 10 from Miss Marwood's evidence, conceded that the track behind the houses in the glebe was not suitable for all pedestrians, but the glebe could be used instead. This turned out to be the only other viable alternative route to the centre of the village or the school. Unfortunately, this does not have the distance recorded on it. However, it would have to be in excess of the 1,080 metres shown in the other unsuitable options. Ms Marwood also highlighted how this application had not followed. I beg your pardon, sir. Miss Banfield from Lower Langford pointed out the lanes between Lower Langford and Wrington were unsafe to walk along and were not suitable for pedestrian access routes. Mr Jones also conceded that it would not be feasible to walk along the lanes to reach the doctor's surgery, despite his figures suggesting otherwise, and suggested the bus. However, he then conceded that the bus was infrequent and the nearest stop at the Langford post office, and did not dispute that this was still a 15-minute walk away from the surgery. We're moving on to Appeal B, Sir, Westwood Close. And regards pedestrian safety, Mrs Edgar described how the proposed safety conditions by highways would not be possible to implement, as they required hedges to be removed and lowered for visibility displays and safety barriers to be installed. She also describes the photographs in her proof of evidence showing the damage the tankers regularly caused to the fence panels due to the restricted width of the track. She also highlighted how the track to the piggeries was set at such an angle that large vehicles needed all the width of the track to manoeuvre, and how the proposed pedestrian access would be dangerous. The current permission for access to the piggeries stipulated that it would be for during normal working hours, and any future cycleway would be for leisure purposes only, so during daylight hours. Any persons using the pedestrian access from the proposed site would be appearing at right angles to the oncoming traffic and have limited visibility. Ms Grieveson also expressed concerns around the safety of allowing Appeal B, given the size and frequency of tankers accessing the treatment works. She also stated that she can see the unmade track from her garden, and pointed out that the exit to the proposed footpath from the site to the unmade track would be exactly where the vehicles to the piggeries stopped to open the gate. Mr Jones gave evidence that whilst the footway was safe, it was not necessary for a PLA to be granted. On being shown photograph 2 from Mrs Edgar's proof of evidence, he agreed that the new pedestrian access point would be situated precisely where the right-hand rear wheel of the large HGV was positioned. He believed that the whole of the proposed new footway would be surfaced, otherwise it would be unsafe. Under loss of amenities for the neighbouring residents, Mrs Edgar gave evidence and set out how her garden bordered the unmade track with a fence, which was not shown on the appellant's ecology note, page 3, with multiple photographs. She confirmed that the appellant had not approached her about lowering the height of her hedges or fencing. Had they done so, it would have been refused, as it would completely removed all privacy and security to her property. However, when questioned, she was assured there would be no requirements to cut her hedges or reduce her fence height. Mrs Edgar pointed out that with the width of the track precluded the installation of lighting, and any such lighting would shine into the rear of her property and those in the Brooklyn and Wiltons. Also, the proposed footway would be used 24 hours a day, and this would have a negative impact on the local residents along the track and the Westwood Close. The imposition of this track with the noise and disturbance it would bring into local residents, and it has not been considered in this application by the appellant, I should add. Hedge boundary to Westwood Close. Mr Gallop gave evidence at the Memorial Hall. He stated how the hedge in Westwood Close had been planted by Mr Victor Sproul in 1973 for the benefit of the local residents, and maintained by himself being, and others for over 50 years. He was clear that this hedge was separate to the unmade track, and was now claiming ownership of the hedge for the continued benefit of residents of Westwood Close. Mrs Edgar stated that her husband also assisted to maintain the hedge in Westwood Close. No one else had been seen to be maintaining this hedge in the 12 years she had lived there. In contrast, the appellant has produced a right of easement along the track signed by Mr Clark. In this, he has claimed not only the track, but also a section of this hedge. However, this document also states he has no title to the land. It is unclear if this section of the track owned by Barney Smith and Christian Joyce would be paved as stated in previous plans. Mr Marsh was not able to assist in this matter. And by way of conclusion, sir, with regard to a PLA, the broad range and number of speakers, not only from the village but also from the surrounding area, emphasises the importance attached to this site. Transition from rural to settlement as one arrives via half yard does have significant impact on the way the village is experienced. At present, the distance to the heritage area is very short, and so the appreciation of the historical aspect is quickly appreciated. If the development were to be built, then this transition would be more urban and longer. Therefore, when the conservation is reached, it would appear smaller and less relevant to the overall image of the village. It would be in danger of becoming referred to as Old Wrington. Therefore, this development will have an adverse effect on the conservation area. The appellant already accepts that there will be some adverse effect on the landscape and the Grade 1 listed church, but classes this as less than substantial. To the villagers, any change resulting in the loss of the views that have been enjoyed over the centuries is considered substantial. This is the same for the loss of the rolling pasture land that has existed since the Middle Ages. The perceived benefits are difficult to ascertain. We question if the 30% requirement of affordable housing has actually been met, given the overwhelming number of one-bedroom houses being offered. The 19% figure of bedrooms that I mentioned yesterday gives a better indication of the space offered. Therefore, we consider this benefit is reduced and carries less weight. The issue of the council not having a 5-year housing supply of land should not be allowed to overrule the harm to the landscape, the harm to the Grade 1 listed church, and the setting in which the classically English village of Wrington sits, or to permit the overwhelming of public services and local infrastructure. The village and the landscape should not be sacrificed to a policy that is outside the control of the villages, but they are the ones who will have to suffer. Instead, we have engaged in this process and feel that our views should carry full weight and tilt the balance against the appeals. To ignore our evidence and that of the council would be to create a vast expanse of houses that are not sustainable and would exacerbate the danger already experienced by villagers. With regard to Appeal B, we say that this is unsafe, has an adverse effect on the neighbouring properties, the ownership of the hedgerow required is disputed, and even the appellant does not think it is necessary, despite it being required for connectivity. This ambiguity is confusing. Therefore, Sir, Keep Wrington as Wrington invites you to dismiss both appeals.
Thank you, Mr. Storer. I think we will take a short break now until 1:45. So we'll adjourn now until 11:45. Thank you. We're adjourned. Time's now 1:45. The inquiry is resumed. Can we hear your closing now, Mr. Boyle, please?
So thank you very much. If I ask Mr. Coombs to circulate it, it's been kindly printed by the authority. So I'm assuming that you'd also like this in electronic copy sent to the inspectorate.
It would be helpful. It'd be one less job for me. Otherwise, I have to scan them and send them to the case officer. So if you could send them to Mr. Brown, the case officer at Bristol, that would be appreciated, please. Thank you.
Do that. So if everybody has. So can I just, before we get into the text of this, pick up two references in my friend Mr. Wadsley's closing. If you have the written text to hand, it's page 14. And it's paragraph 35.2. If you have that. In fact, it's an observation that was also made, I think, in opening, suggesting that the Council's been flexible under policy CS 32. Can I just ask you to note against paragraph 35.2, and this is not in any way in dispute. The first of those references to Cox's Green, of course, is to an appeal. It's not by authority granting permission. The authority opposed permission under CS 32, and your colleague granted it under the document is CD 5.23. Can't be 5.23, forgive me. J. I can't read my own writing. It's CDJ.23, sorry, J.23. That's the Cox's Green decision. And then the second reference to Gatcombe Farm. So you've got the committee report at CDI 4. Now that was a grant of permission, but it's not a CS 32 case because it's outside the settlement. It's a CS 33, I think it is, which is the countryside and infill policy. So if you wouldn't mind just making those notes. And then the other reference, if you'll forgive me, is paragraph 46 on page 17. There's an observation about the importance of the Northern Link because of third parties' comments, and then it says, and lack of safety, in brackets. So you'll recall that the Statement of Common Ground on Highways and Transportation, and the reference is paragraph 3.15, paragraph 3.15, confirms that the Appeal B scheme is not sought by the Highways Authority on the basis of lack of safety of the alternative route via the Butts Batch entrance. Thank you. And then, so if you wouldn't mind taking up my text, there's just an amendment and a gap to fill in at paragraph 43. It's footnote 46 in relation to paragraph 43. And I'm afraid it's my fault. I obviously was writing this last night and didn't have the text in front of me to get the correct phraseology. So where you see the words total loss or significant vitiation of that significance, would you mind crossing that out and instead inserting in inverted commas the phrase where it is vitiated altogether or very much reduced, and then close inverted commas. And the footnote reference is CD 5.30, which is the Built Heritage Statement. and it's paragraph 422, where that quote is given, and its origin, which is a case called Bedford. But the case is cited in the footnote to paragraph 422. I just don't want there to be a mistake as to the phraseology. So thank you for that. With that, I can now turn to the text and begin. So these closing submissions are, as you know, made on behalf of the appellants in respect of an appeal against the refusal of permission for an outline application for up to 61 dwellings and associated development on land at Butts Batch, Wrington. We call that Appeal A. And against the non-determination of an application for a footpath and cycle link adjacent to Westward Close, Wrington, we call that Appeal B. Appeal A was refused, so as you very well know, for two reasons. Reason refusal 1, heritage. Reason refusal 2, landscape, and is opposed by the Council. Appeal B is not opposed by the Council, but it is opposed by the local action group Keep Wrington. Accordingly, so you'll recall at the beginning of the inquiry, you identified the following main issues, and I set those out: Appeal A, little 1, little 2, little 3, and Appeal B, a single issue. I won't read those out directly, because I take them as headings hereafter. So I observe the submissions will take these main issues in turn, but I turn first to consider the development plan and national policy context. So, under the heading of policy. The adopted development plan comprises the North Somerset Core Strategy, adopted 2017, and the North Somerset Sites and Policies Part 1, the Development Management Policies 2016, and the North Somerset Sites and Policies Part 2, that's the Site Allocation Plan 2018. We also know that as the SAP. There's no neighbourhood plan for Wrington, and the emerging replacement local plan is at too early a stage to be accorded more than very little weight. That's a reference again to the Statement of Common Ground. Adopted Core Strategy Policy CS13 sets housing numbers to be delivered in the planned period, but this is acknowledged not to be an NPPF compliant assessment of housing need, and was only adopted on the expectation of an early review by 2018, which has not taken place. In any event, the core strategy is now more than 5 years old, and its adopted housing requirement is replaced by reference to the higher requirement derived from the government standard method. Core Strategy Policy CS14 then distributes the adopted housing requirement, including directing additional development to what's called service villages, as defined in the core strategy. Settlement boundaries are fixed by the SAP, carried forward ultimately from the 2007 local plan, and accompanied by allocations which only seek to exceed CS13 housing numbers by some 800 units, rather than the 2,500 sought by the examining inspector. A situation only found acceptable on the basis the core strategy was at the time expected to be replaced shortly after adoption of the SAP. Under Core Strategy Policy CS32, Wrington is classified as a service village, where the development is encouraged both within and adjoining the settlement boundary. Thus, there is, we say, no policy objection to the principle of breaching the SAP settlement boundaries at Wrington. As such, the Statement of Common Ground agrees that Wrington is a sustainable settlement for additional housing growth. The site adjoins the adopted settlement boundary of Wrington and has ready access both along Butts Batch, which is to have additional footway provided, and by a link, the subject of Appeal B, to the facilities and services of the village within easy walking and cycling distance. Consequently, the Statement of Common Ground further agrees the site is locationally appropriate for residential development in terms of Policy CS32. Policy CS32 is supportive of residential development within and adjacent to settlement boundaries of service villages such as Wrington, subject to 7 criteria, which the appellant considers have been met. Of those 7 criteria, the Council only alleges breach of criteria 1 and 4 by reference to the heritage and landscape objections in Reason 1 and Reason 2. Importantly, given how Mr. Reynolds sought to develop and widen his objection, the Council does not allege breach of criterion 3, inadequate services and facilities, nor criterion 5, cumulative impact. The one aspect of policy CS32 which is acknowledged to be breached is the procedural requirement in the last proviso of the policy that schemes of over around 25 dwellings should be brought forward through local plan or neighbourhood plan allocation. However, that procedural requirement in CS32 does not impose an overall limit on either the number or size of individual sites within the settlement boundary, nor the number of sites outside the settlement boundary, but under 25 dwellings, nor indeed the size that may be brought forward outside settlement boundaries through a local or neighbourhood plan allocation. In short, as recognised by recent appeal decisions, CS32 does not limit dwelling numbers to be provided at any given service village. Absent an objection made and sustained under criteria 3 and 5 of CS32, there can be no substantive as opposed to procedural objection to a proposal for 61 dwellings at Wrington. No such case is made or evidenced by the Council. Mr. Reynolds sought to mount a sustainability case founded on a reference to the settlement hierarchy within the second, that is, the landscape reason for refusal. By contrast, the truth is the sustainability of Wrington will be materially enhanced by the provision of the development at appeal. In contrast to the tales of inexorable decline proffered by the Council, the sustainability aims of CS32 at Wrington will not be furthered by using that as a reason for choking off schemes such as this, merely because they have had to come through the application and appeal route. Delivery of schemes such as this one positively fosters those aims. The correct starting point, therefore, is the Section 38.6 development plan is supportive in principle of additional residential development, including outside settlement boundaries, at Wrington, as a sustainable settlement for additional growth, and this site is acknowledged to be sustainably located vis-à-vis that sustainable settlement. As such, despite Mr. Reynolds' valiant attempts, it is notable that neither of the Council's reason for refusal actually objects to the principal development as being outside the now out-of-date settlement boundaries. Reason 1 asserts heritage objection, now limited to impact on the setting of All Saints' Church, and Reason 2 asserts a landscape objection. In any event, even had the Council formulated such a reason for refusal, recent appeal decisions have indicated quite correctly, we'd suggest, that the objection based on developing at service villages, including Wrington, not via a neighbourhood plan, should only be accorded limited weight and would not stand in the way of sustainable development. This is because CS32, as part of the North Somerset core strategy, is itself out of date for both of two important reasons. First, spatial strategy is predicated on an assessment of development needs, that's policy CS13, which was acknowledged at the time not to be in accordance with the MPPF, but judged to be acceptable if subject to review by 2018, which has not taken place, and is now replaced by the increased requirement under the standard method. As such, its housing distribution under policies CS14 and CS32 is out of date, as are the adopted settlement boundaries upon which the restraining policies operate. Those policies may, therefore, be accorded reduced weight as being predicated on the out-of-date assessment of development needs, and I reference the Hopkins-Holmes case. Secondly, and in addition, in the light of the three most recent appeal decisions, the Council has been obliged to concede that it cannot demonstrate the required 5-year housing land supply, put at either 3.2 or 3.5 years, and as such it's agreed that footnote 8 of the MPPF is engaged, deeming the, quotes, most important policies out of date, including most pertinently CS32 and the settlement boundaries it operates against. Consequently, it's agreed that CS32 is one of the most important policies. By both of these two factors, it is an out-of-date policy for the purpose of paragraph 11D of the MPPF. In such circumstances, the breach of procedural requirements that sites over 25 dwellings be brought forward through the neighbourhood plan or local plan process can only be accorded limited weight. It is a policy negative, but as has been accepted by inspectors in all 4 recent appeals, that's Cox's Green, Moor Road, Rectory Farm and Farley Farm, it is not one which justifies the withholding of permission for much needed housing development. So I turn then for Appeal A to your first main issue, impact on All Saints' Church. So as to heritage, reason for refusal 1, the Council has now abandoned its objection in respect of the impact of development on the setting of the conservation area. It is, we'd suggest, right to do so. The appeal site sits removed from the conservation area, separated from it by undistinguished 20th century development. Although Qua sought to maintain an objection as regards the conservation area, that assertion is now without any expert support. The Council maintains its objection by reference to the impact on the development of the setting of All Saints' Church, notably the tower. However, through its witness, it only asserts a less than substantial harm at the lowermost end of the scale. This is the level of harm, described as very minor harm, agreed at paragraph 722 of the appellant's built heritage statement. Further, it's agreed the heritage significance of the church derived principally from its fabric, which is unaffected by the proposals. While it's accepted that some significance is contributed to by the setting, the experts have agreed that the more important part of the setting is that most immediate to the church, through the views afforded from the churchyard and between the buildings in the historic core of the village, all of which, again, are unaffected by the proposals. Further, although the wider landscape setting also has a lesser positive role to play, the more important locations within which to appreciate the significance of the tower as part of the church lie to the west of Wrington, where the rural setting of the church and village will continue to be apparent, again unaffected by the appeal proposals. Consequently, Dr. Hudson Macaulay orally corrected reference to objections from the western footpaths and replaced them with references to the southern permissive path along the south side of the River Yeo. From this perspective, and also along Half Yard itself, there are only limited views of the upper part of the tower, seen in the context of existing 20th century development of an undistinguished nature. Views across the appeal site, the only ones now objected to by the council's witness, are always in the context of this existing backdrop. The views from the permissive path are intermittent, given the vegetation on the riverbanks. Importantly, views of the church tower will remain. It will always be appreciated that there is an historic tower of note, signifying a church of note, serving its historic village and parish, and visible in the landscape. It may be that some views are lost or reduced, but even from the south, the church tower will be appreciable as such. For this reason, both the council and the appellant's experts accept a less than substantial harm at the lowermost end of the scale. Less substantial harm to heritage asset triggers the operation of paragraph 202 of the MPPF, where such a heritage harm is to be weighed against the public benefits of the scheme. The matter, as you know, is now being explored in evidence, but the appellant's clear planning evidence is that even with the Barnwell approach, this lowermost end of less substantial harm is comfortably outweighed by the manifest public benefits of housing and affordable housing in the context of deficits in both against need, the economic contribution, the landscape improvements, and the significant biodiversity net gain achieved. So this is not, we suggest, a surprising outcome. The church is Grade 1 listed, but the harbour has been contained to the bottom end of the scale, and the public benefits of the scheme are compelling. Accordingly, the requirements of paragraph 202 of the NPPF are met. The proposal is policy compliant as regards heritage impact. There is, therefore, no, quote, clear reason to withhold permission on heritage grounds. Reason refusal 1 is not made out, and paragraph 11d(1) of the NPPF is not engaged. I then turn, sir, to Appeal A, your main issue 2, which is impact on the landscape. As to landscape, that is reason refusal 2, the council acknowledges the site does not form part of a valued landscape for the purpose of paragraph 174A of the MPPF. As such, it is off the bottom of the scale of the hierarchy in terms of paragraph 175 of the MPPF. That does not mean the local landscape has no value in GLIVIA terms, GLVIA terms, but it cannot possibly have the high value that Mr. Etchell sought to give it. The high sensitivity of the Wardle-Armstrong high-level assessment must equally give way for the reasons given in the Rectory Road decision, and also due to the author's own health warning that the more detailed granularity of site assessment would be required. This has been done, that is, this has been done in the evidence before you, sir, and given the influence of the stark existing settlement edge and the provision of a reinstated hedge line to define and mark the full stop of development to the west, the sensitivity is properly recorded by Mr. Lier as medium. Moreover, policy CS32 is predicated on the acceptability of a degree of landscape and visual harm, as must inevitably arise when developing a greenfield site outside the settlement boundary. Localized landscape character and visual impact is to be expected, therefore, and is not a reason for withholding otherwise beneficial development. This informs the approach to policy DM10, which only seeks to prevent unacceptable landscape impact, and acknowledges that where beneficial development brings landscape impact, appropriate mitigation should be secured, as indeed is the case here. Indeed, this is a scheme which is and will always be seen in the context of the existing and architecturally undistinguished part of the village, and brings with it notable landscape improvements, not least the reinstatement of lost historic field boundaries and planting to soften what is currently a stark settlement edge. Even put at its highest, by year 15, the Council's assessment of landscape impact is only moderate, and that in respect of an area which is not a valued landscape for MPPF paragraph 174A purposes. Consistent with the MPPS beauty agenda, considerable care has gone into the placemaking aspects of the scheme to create a proposal which will enhance the settlement of Wrington rather than detract from it. None of that is objected to by the Council. In the context of Section 13 of the MPPF, that is a matter which should materially weigh in favour of the approval of the scheme. Certainly so on the evidence, the localised and limited landscape and visual impact of this proposal, which is only that which is axiomatic of greenfield development, supported in principle by policy CS32, and in respect of a non-valued landscape, by no means justifies the withholding of permission. And so I've just given you a footnote reference to how the Rectory Road Inspector judged weight to be given to a similar conclusion. I then, sir, turn to Appeal A in your third main matter, the planning balance. Section 38.6 requires that decisions be in accordance with development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. The Section 38.6 development plan is supportive of development outside the out-of-date settlement boundaries of service villages such as Wrington, where this will enhance the sustainability of the settlements, which this proposal will do. The only requirement of the development plan which is breached is the procedural requirement that such developments over around 25 dwellings are brought forward through allocations. But this is acknowledged to be worthy of only limited weight, as a result both of the spatial strategy encompassed by policies CS13, CS14 and CS32 being out of date in their own terms, and by virtue of the operation of footnote 8 of the MPPF, as the Council cannot demonstrate the required 5-year housing land supply. By virtue of the most important policies being out of date, paragraph 11D of the MPPF is engaged. Heritage harm is characterised as the lowermost end of the less than substantial category of impact, and the scheme's benefit outweigh this, consistent with the test in paragraph 202 of the MPPF and the duty in section 66(1) of the Listed Buildings Act. As a result, paragraph 11D(1) is not applicable. The landscape harm is, at the highest the Council puts it, moderate at year 15 in respect of a landscape which does not qualify as a valued landscape for the purposes of paragraph 174A of the MPPF. In the balance, this and the quotes very minor heritage harm must significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the scheme, I should say, if permission is to be refused. The housing and affordable housing benefits are undeniable. National policy is seeking to boost housing provision. The Council is failing to deliver the required quantum of either. The economic contribution is undisputed as to its quantum or nature. There is public open space and play provision. There is landscape improvement, additional heritage benefit in terms of opening up currently unavailable views of the tower, and significant biodiversity net gain. Taken together, these many and manifest benefits are not outweighed by the limited degrees of harms in a broadly positive policy context and in the face of pressing need for housing, either significantly or at all. The correct position is, we'd suggest, as recorded by Mr. Marsh, the benefits in fact outweigh the harms. Then so I turn to a series of additional objections taken by QAR in respect of Appeal A, but not supported by the authority. So as noted above, QAR maintain an objection in respect to the impact conservation area. It respectfully submitted they're wrong to do so, it having been agreed between the heritage experts that no harm arises to the conservation area, as the development is at a remove from even the extended area of designation, and there is intervening settlement of an undistinguished nature. The scheme itself is acknowledged by the Council to be a high-quality design and placemaking in accordance with Section 13 of the MPPF, and the incorporating of the parameter plans by condition is agreed to mean the development principles they show will be delivered at reserved matters stage. QAR also maintained the impact of the church should be characterised as substantial rather than the agreed less than substantial at the lowermost end of the scale. This, however, is at odds with the case law and guidance that substantial harm to significance is, and then my corrected quote, where it is vitiated altogether or very much reduced. Qua, through Mrs. Marwood, assert a highway safety objection to the walking route into the village via Butts Batch, but this is directly contrary to the agreement with the Highways Authority that the route is safe and appropriate for pedestrians, including for parents and children to access the primary school. Mrs. Marwood of King's Road herself, despite her expressed concerns, walks her children to and from school rather than face the extra time taken by putting them in a car. She said her neighbours did the same, except when it was raining. The route is safe, despite having a historic character, with evidence of good usage by pedestrian cyclists, as befits a small knit fabric of an historic village. Qua, through Mrs. Abdul Wahab, sought to raise an objection in respect of land quality. However, observations of silage cuts mean nothing in the context of significant chemical fertilizer being applied on the land, as the photographs seem to indicate. The Agricultural Land Classification Survey concluded the field in question was Category 4, which is not best most versatile land. The report is by independent consultants and may so be relied upon by you. No other assessment is before the inquiry. Qua's concerns over flooding and surface and foul drainage were addressed by Mr. Stoodley for the appellant, the Council as lead local flood authority, and forgive me if I've got the name of the water undertaker incorrect, I put here Southwest Water, as a water undertaker are content with the drainage strategy, that the drainage strategy is appropriate. It's respectfully submitted that none of these points amount to warranted objections to Appeal A. So I then turn to Appeal B and the single main matter, whether there are other considerations to justify refusal, given that the Council do not oppose it. Appeal B is not opposed by the Council either as local planning authority nor as local highway authority. Its provision is agreed not to be for any reason concerning the safety of the alternative pedestrian cycle route by Butts Batch. In addition, Mr. Jones has provided the distances to services and facilities for both routing options. They are not materially different. Nonetheless, the appellant recognises the Appeal B route improves connectivity into the village, and while not necessary, does seek to rely upon its provision as a benefit of the Appeal A scheme. Appeal B is acceptable, therefore, in its own terms. Suggestions by Qua of amenity impact are misplaced given the relatively low footfall and the fact that the access forms part of the intended link to the Strawberry Line, which Qua does not find objectionable. Existing amenity issues created by dust should be alleviated by the provision of a bonded surface beside number 7, and the privacy concerns raised by Mrs. that should say Edgar, not Marwood. Mrs. Edgar appear predicated on the erroneous assumption that the hedge and fence along her northern boundary was proposed to be reduced to 600 millimetres for sight lines. As she accepted by reference to the relevant plans, that is not the proposal, which does not require any part of her demise. Similarly, Qua's case that Appeal B is not deliverable by reference to rival ownership claims over the adjacent hedgerow is misconceived. Whoever owns the hedgerow in private law is irrelevant to the implementation of Appeal B, which is to be a public right-of-way. The disputed hedge lies wholly within the extent of the adopted public highway, and the Highways Authority can authorise necessary highways works under a Section 278 agreement, either undertaken by themselves or by the developer under their authorisation. The non-highway land is now subject to easements granted by the relevant landowners. Consequently, the works proposed under Appeal B are all deliverable, and the proposals themselves are not only acceptable, they are positively to be welcomed as adding further to the accessibility of the Appeal A scheme. And so lastly, I turn to conclusions. For Appeal A, breach of the procedural requirement within the out-of-date policy CS32 should not be a barrier to sustainable development here in a manner otherwise supported by CS32 itself. The spatial strategy of CS13, CS14 and CS32 is out of date in its own terms by the operation of footnote 8 of the MPPF. Consequently, paragraph 11D is engaged. By operation of paragraph 202 of the MPPF, heritage matters do not provide a clear reason for refusal under paragraph 11D(1), taking the decision maker to the tilted balance under paragraph 11D(2). Weighing the many and manifest planning benefits against the limited and localized adverse effects, it's respectfully submitted that a PLA is a scheme which should be very obviously allowed in the light of both national policy and local circumstances, and planning permission should be granted in the public interest. Appeal B is not opposed by the Council, and while not necessary, it materially improves the connectivity of the PLA scheme for future residents and is commended as unobjectionable in its own terms and is relied upon as a further benefit of a PLA. It too, we would respectfully therefore submit, should be granted permission in the public interest. And so consequently, sir, for all of those reasons, you are respectfully invited to allow both appeals and to grant permission for this much needed development.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. I think that more or less concludes matters. We've still got the finer detail of the site visit to deal with, or at least to check my understanding of what's proposed. So can we do that now, please? I'm mindful. I think I said yesterday that I was probably taking a bit of a pessimistic view on progress today. We've finished a bit earlier than I was anticipating. Did I say that we'd go to the neighbouring properties at some point between 2 and 3? Yes, that was my recollection. Rather than trying to revisit that and cause people any headaches around A, trying to reorganise that, and B, anguish for the parties concerned. We'll stick with that and perhaps look at what we might actively do before then. So can I just take us all to the material I've been given? I've got a sort of a coloured aerial photograph with some annotation on it. I've got an extract plan with, well, it's essentially photographic viewpoints which have been highlighted, and then I've got the 4 properties we're going to go and visit. Oh, there's something else on the reverse of that as well. Oh, it's where they are. Okay, I've got that. So, can I just check I've understood these correctly? So the viewpoints which are highlighted on this plan is the idea that those which are highlighted are the ones you want me to have a look at, and I'd do those on an unaccompanied basis. I got that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Never assume. So, but thank you for confirming that. And I think you were right. I have seen 4 of these. I've not seen 18 yet, but I've seen the others. But I'll go and see all of them today at some point. Which takes us to the colourful aerial photograph. The site is outlined red, I can see that clearly. It is the idea that I essentially walk this. This is the blue line, which partly extends into the site, so that part would be accompanied. So there's a big sort of square at one end and an arrow at the other, which suggests to me that the suggestion is that I start at the big square and proceed in an anti-clockwise direction to the end of the arrow. Is that the general idea?
Broadly, sir, as I suggested the other day, it's a linear route, so it's a case of where one starts, but it was more just to give an indication that that those sort of dead-end elements within the centre, one has to go back on themselves. Okay,
so I think the message is it doesn't really matter so long as I cover all the ground. And there's a detour into the site, which will be the accompanied element, and there's also a detour along what is essentially appeal site B, which I'm happy to do on an unaccompanied basis. Because it's well, I've already done it to all intents and purposes. Okay, that's helpful. In terms of the logistics, then, I think we can do the accompanied part on site before we go and see the people off site, and it's essentially an L. So if we gather at the entrance on Butts Batch, it'll take a little while to get up to the first Mrs. Markovich book. Does anybody have any idea how long it will take to walk up there? Or is there a cunning plan about car sharing? I think given the COVID outbreaks, it probably makes sense for us not all to get into a car and share. So I would suggest we walk from the site up there, or we make our own way, I should say. I'll probably end up walking, personally. So any thoughts on how long we'll need on site? Half an hour? Yeah, okay. So if we sort of work backwards from there, if it is half an hour, and then give ourselves an extra half-hour leeway and just getting a travel time to get up to the first site visit, and let's aim for hitting there at 2 o'clock. That means us getting together on site at 1, I think. Does that fit with everybody's plans? And I can sort out the rest from there. So if we meet at the site entrance on Butts Batch at 1 o'clock, can I make a note of who'll be representing the three main parties, please? For the council first, please.
It will be myself, Roger Wilmot, and Kate Hudson Macaulay.
Okay, thank you. And for Keith Wrington as Wrington?
I was going to restrict it to myself, sir, I think, in the interests of...
Okay, thank you, Mr. Storer. And Mr. Coombs for the appellant. Okay, on that basis, we will meet up for the site visit at 1. Just a reminder that I'll be, all being well, unless there are any bombshells, I'll be closing the inquiry shortly. And once the inquiry is closed, and certainly the site visit isn't an opportunity for anybody to discuss the case or attempt to submit evidence. I mean, as I've already indicated, if you do want to draw something as a matter of fact to my attention, like there's a gate or there's a hedge, very happy for you to do that, or there's a church, that's an obvious one. But please don't make any qualitative comments on the gate, hedge or church. I've heard the evidence now. Okay, so we'll convene at 1, those of us doing the site visit. Anything else before I close? Mr. Coombs,
very briefly, at the opening of the inquiry, we commented that we had large format versions of some of the viewpoints.
Oh, you did, yes.
I can pass them to you now or at site, whichever is preferable.
Well, I think it makes sense to do it now, because I'll be seeing those on an unaccompanied basis, and if with a fair wind, I may well see those before we meet on site. So just for everybody's benefit, that these were described earlier in proceedings, and they are what's already in the evidence. It's just large printed format versions of them to assist the site visit. Is that correct?
They're in the format that Mr. Lié described, that allows you to hold them out on site in accordance with the guidance, say that you should then get a good representation of what you're actually seeing replicated on the sheet. Obviously, when you have smaller versions, it's always smaller than you apparently see in your eye, so that's why we've produced them for you.
Yeah, that was my understanding, but thank you for the update and clarification. Anything else before I close? No? Okay, it just leaves me to thank everybody for their contributions, both here at Wrington during proceedings. It was a well-mannered inquiry, and I appreciate everybody's efforts in that regard, and special thanks to the IT and tech people here who've allowed us to live stream and also allow people to join remotely. It's very much appreciated. So thank you all. Safe journey to wherever you're going, and I'll see some of you later at the site visit. The inquiry is now closed. Thank you.